Welcome to The Aftermath, a podcast that rips the Band-Aid off the collective scars of divorce, custody battles, and the trauma of family drama. Kindra Reiber and Mick Smith pull back the curtain and explore stories that put the heart-wrenching puzzle pieces together with inspiring stories, notable experts, and actionable tips. Let the healing begin. Well, welcome once again. This is Mick, the Doctor of Digital, and also Kindra Reiber, our co-parenting mentor. For today's episode, we have Heidi Dunstan, but we want to continue making a positive impact on individuals like yourself and people who are listening. So we want to ensure that no one feels isolated. And we kindly ask your support, of course, to be liking, positively reviewing The Aftermath on Apple Podcasts and sharing The Aftermath as you find value. With that, we're also going to welcome Heidi Dunstan. Heidi is here and she's going to assist us and teach us about her area of expertise, which is grief. Heidi shares tips and ways to support yourself and others while grieving with simple, practical ways to grieve with grace. And I love that phrase. That's almost like a song. So welcome to the program, Heidi. Good to see you today.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Heidi, this is so relevant on the topic because we're talking grief and we asked you to come on because part of divorce is grieving, right? Our past life, grieving the loss of time with our children. We have them grieving the memories with our spouse and the good times. And so there's a lot that goes into that. And a lot of people probably don't think about grief when they think about divorce. And Mick and I just thought it was so relevant to the topic and what we talk to people about because sometimes you're just so in the midst of going through the divorce, you don't take the time to grieve. And so that's what we really want to talk to you about today. So we're excited to have you on. I will have to give a little disclaimer that I just lost my puppy of 4 years. And so if we say something or Heidi says something that triggers it and I'm taking a moment to sob, I'm just letting everybody know that's what's going on. So it's very fresh.
And it is. And grief, because we don't talk about it in our world, when all of a sudden we do, it can feel really significant.
Since we're on the topic, could you give us just a basic definition of what is grief? Let's start out there. What is it? Let's define it.
Grief is a normal and healthy reaction to loss or change of any kind. So a lot of people think we just grieve when somebody dies or an animal dies, but it is when we experience change. So we talk about empty nest syndrome. People grieve during COVID. People grieve when they have a change in their health. People grieve when they go through divorce or they move different communities. It's everywhere in our world because when we change, we miss the things that we've moved away from.
And I was curious because one of the classic definitions, and I wondered if you had followed this or not, or you have disagreements with it, but one of the classic descriptions of grief is Kubler-Ross's, their grief cycle. That's what they call DABDA, which is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Do you follow the grief cycle or do you have some disagreements with Kubler-Ross?
Well, Kubler-Ross it's actually the 5 stages of dying, not the 5 stages of grief. So that's how it often gets misnomered. And the hard part is that they are the stages that somebody goes through when they find out they're losing their life, when they've got a terminal illness or something's going on there. And so lots of times people think it's the same for grief, but it isn't. Like those stages are there, but the hard part for us is we think a stage means that you're through it and done,
Mm.
Mm.
that you're going to go through shock and be done, that you're going to go through anger and be done. And it's not, it's a hot mess, right? Like I lost my husband unexpectedly 5 years ago, and there are still days where I'm sad. There are still days when I'm angry. And it doesn't mean that I'm stuck. It's just they are the emotions that come with grief.
And I think
Does it
you're
go ahead,
making a
Mick?
point that you can go back and forth through different stages. And I think one thing I'm really curious about, if you could address this as well, people don't move through grief at the same time or in the same process, which makes it really difficult when you are around, as most of us are, with friends and family.
Exactly. Grief says individuals your fingerprint. None of us do it the same, right? You think about it Somebody who loses a pet, they might cry their eyes out for days or weeks on end, and somebody else may never shed a tear. Neither one of them is wrong. It's how they do it. It's how they process it. We're all equipped with different tools and different emotions. We all have different relationships with people, you know, and so we all move through grief at a different pace and a different way, and that's okay.
So, do you anticipate grief or can you anticipate grief if you're going to go through a divorce or what does that look like?
Yeah, it's called anticipatory grief, and it's totally normal, right? I have a 16-year-old cat. I know that she's going to die one day. Do I cry about it? There are days that I do, right? There's other days where I'm like, it's okay. I don't want you to be in pain. But yes, anticipatory grief is very common.
Mm.
And so when you know that a relationship is coming to an end, especially if you're kind of starting to make the decisions to maybe leave, of course you're going to have grief. Nobody gets married to get divorced,
Correct. Yes.
right? And so, I mean, the reality is when you are making the decision to step away from that relationship and all that it entails, it could entail your home, it could entail your community, it could entail your friends, it could entail your children. It means that you will grieve.
How do you recognize that as a person when you're going through things?
Honestly, it's really about relating to the feelings. And the hard part with grief is I call it the umbrella term. It's a term that covers a ton of emotions. So it could have sadness, it could have anger, it could have regret, it could have hopelessness, it could have guilt, it could also have gratitude, it could also have hope, it could have, relief. If you've been in a situation for a long time and you're like, I'm finally taking a step to step into my power and step away from a relationship, there might be relief there, right? And so the hard part is because there's so many emotions, people get confused. I can tell you, like, I had a conversation recently with a friend of mine who just had breast cancer surgery. And she was talking to me about her body and how it looked different and how she's trying to move through all these emotions. I said, my friend, you're grieving. And immediately the tears came. She was like, I never put words to it. You're right. I am. I'm grieving the fact that this isn't normal, that this isn't what I had planned. This is a big change that I wasn't anticipating. And so it really is about identifying the feelings and going, okay, I'm sad that this isn't what I wanted. And when you can see that and know that it's normal, know that it's a response that you need to have. If you didn't, it would almost be sociopathic, right? Like we grieve things that we care about. We grieve things that we love. And so it is normal to grieve them. It wouldn't hurt if we didn't love these things in our lives. And lots of people think your marriage needed to end. They weren't nice to you, or this is way better for you. It doesn't give the key to skip grief. There's still the emotional component to move through the grief to get to a point where you feel like you've got your feet back under you and that you're able to get back into moving forward in your life.
When you say that there's hope in grief, I never considered that. So, when I was going through my divorce, the hope that I had, that I was still hanging on to it, was scheduling counseling. And then I'm Christian, so I had watched The War Room. And so I had turned my bedroom into the war room, just prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. I never connected that as a part of grief. I thought grief was when we were officially done. And then I started crying, right? And having those emotions. So that you bring up a very good point. But you said something before, Heidi, and I want you to elaborate. How do you make space? How do you allow, you keep using that term, making space or giving time to grieve? What does that look like? What does that mean?
Well, lots of times we live in a world that doesn't like pain. And so we try to skip it. We try to just move like, oh, this doesn't feel good. I'm going to go. And oftentimes that's where things like addiction come in and other kind of people trying to cope, right? Rather than feel the feels. And I'm just as guilty. When I lost my husband, I spent a lot of time going, why am I here? Why am I having to go through this again? Why does this hurt so much? which kept me up here. Whereas if I just acknowledge the emotions, this is hard. I miss my husband. I miss my person. I miss this. Or I'm angry because it puts me in my heart and it allows me to move through the emotions. Now, sometimes I'll be honest, those emotions are dark and they're heavy and they're yucky. But I allowed myself to be there. And when I was like, okay, I can't be here anymore. I need to do whatever's next in life. I moved to gratitude. Gratitude was my tool where I was grateful I had him. I was grateful that of the people that were around me that got me through it, that would take me out. So I wasn't in the dark depths for days and weeks on end. I mean, it was dark, but it got me functional again. It's a very helpful practice for me. Some people it doesn't work. Gratitude does work for me, but you have to hold the space for those feelings. Just the good feelings are just as important as the hard ones. And I truly believe that when you move through those emotions, you come out better on the other side. Now, lots of people say that you're stronger. And I'll be honest, I think that's BS. It takes a lot of courage to move through those. So many people said to me, Heidi, you're so strong. I didn't feel very strong. It took a lot of courage. I had to be very brave to get up and put one foot in front of the other each day, just as somebody who's going through a divorce has to. In those early days, weeks, months, every time you go to court, every time that there's a setback, it takes a lot of courage to keep showing up.
Yeah, I just think that's the word that everybody uses because that sounds right, saying strength, because you got through it or you're going through it. But you're right. I like the word courage.
The
And
problem with
it's
strength
okay.
is you're strong. I don't need to help you.
Oh, good point.
Think about it that way, right? It's like, you got this. It's like, raw. I don't want your pom poms and cheerleader. I want you to show up for me. I want you to say, I see that this isn't easy. I see that you're not eating and you've lost so much weight. Right? I lost 30 pounds in the first 3 months after Mike died. Everybody said I looked fabulous except for one friend who said, is it because you're not eating? Right. And so be that person. And we can have that conversation a little later, but there's ways to show up and hold space for people, but there's also ways that you need to show up for yourself to move through the emotions because that'll help you to move forward, to acknowledge the fact that this sucks. This is hard. Right. But if you don't move through those emotions, they will come out in other ways, whether physically through your body and your health, whether how you communicate with your kids or the people around you and your behavior. It all makes such a big difference. I'll be honest with you. I am the queen of scheduling. I tried to schedule grief. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't. Like, I was like, I got 2 hours. Let's grieve. No. Right? It hit me at the grocery store when I no longer had to buy milk because my husband drank 4 liters of milk every 2 days. No different than it would hit a parent who is like, I don't need to buy Oreos this weekend because I don't have my kid, or Egos, or whatever their favorite food is. It's about giving yourself permission to move through the yuck. And we don't live in a society that likes yuck.
Whenever anybody says, how are you today? Usually want to hear back from them, I'm great or I'm good.
Yeah, we force people to lie
Mhm.
because they're supposed to say I'm good, fine, or okay, and you're none of those.
Yeah.
I was none of those for about 18 months after my husband died. And I'm sure that most people that have gone through a divorce or that are going through a divorce, it can be that or longer, depending on how long it takes to process, like court systems and all that. I know some divorces that go on for 4 years, 5 years.
Mhm.
And so the grief can go on. And I believe that grief is love. And so I will love my husband till the last breath I take, which means I will also grieve him till the last breath I take.
Mhm.
And I believe that's true for people that go through divorce, as much as there might be animosity and lots of negatively charged emotions. You loved this person first.
Mhm.
And so you will grieve them. It may just look a little different.
Mhm.
I'm curious about this concept of leaving space or having space. And I'm wondering if you could distinguish between certain things. Like, if we have space for anticipated grief and we have grief, and I'm wondering if there was any connection to things like depression, and is there a difference? Do we allow ourselves enough space to be depressed, to be grieving, or to anticipate grief? And are there distinctions between those different stages?
Well, typically, like you have anticipatory grief before a loss happens, right? So people that have family members that have ALS or cancer, like a terminal cancer, they will often go through anticipatory grief. They will start grieving before the person is gone. No different than a family member or a couple that's going through a divorce. If there is conversation that the relationship is going to dissolve, there is going to be anticipatory grief. Add kids to the mix, and that's going to add more grief, right? Because it's going to change the relationship of that family unit, and they will grieve the whole family unit, not just your spouse. Does that make sense? And so, and then when actually what ends up happening is that the relationship dissolves, that people go their own ways, and you find out what that normal looks like. There will be grief for the loss. There'll be grief for the change. There'll be grief, like you'll grieve financials because your finances are definitely going to be different. You're going to grieve your home. You're going to grieve the fact that you don't have, that you're now a single parent, and that there's going to be times where you're like, I need to go to the grocery store, but the baby's sleeping and I can't go. That's where those are the little griefs that we don't necessarily see as grief, right? We see the frustration, the anger, but we don't necessarily see it as an emotional grief. And yet that's what it is. I always I tell people we grieve everywhere. Kids grieve, right? Little kids will grieve when they've dropped their ice cream, or when their balloon floats away, or they've lost their pet rock. And what happens is lots of times we fill that void and we give them a new ice cream, we give them a new rock, or we get them a new balloon. But if we worked our quote, I call it grief muscle, no different than when you go to the gym and you actually talk to them about how they feel, you'll start to see that you're able to hold space and let them move through the emotion. Teenagers also grieve. You take a device away or you turn the Wi-Fi off. That's grief. It looks very different than maybe a 2 or 3-year-old. Theirs might have a
Sure.
little bit more anger charge to it, but it's grief, plain and simple. And so when we lose the things that are important to us, we grieve. And the hard part is we don't talk about grief very often. As much as it's everywhere, we don't talk about it and we don't label it. And so people don't really know what it is. And so when all of a sudden they go, I'm grieving, okay, that makes more sense. They don't like it. Nobody loves grief because it's a lot of hard emotions before you get to the good one.
Mhm.
But it's about giving yourself the time to move through those emotions, and everybody does it at their own pace. I met a lady about 6 months after my husband died at a counseling session. I was leaving and I looked like I'd been at a counseling session for an hour. And she said, did you just come out of the grief room? And I said, yeah. She goes, how long ago did you lose your husband? I said, 6 months ago. She goes, do the work now. She goes, my husband died 7 years ago and I ran away and I've been traveling for 7 years and I now have to do the work,
Wow.
right? So we can have delayed grief where we just avoid.
Mm.
And some people will do that in divorce. They will end a relationship and move into another one and not necessarily move through all the emotions.
How do you know when you're done grieving? Because I feel like sometimes some of the situations you're explaining, we could continually grieve. And this comes into play too with, something we talk about quite frequently on the show is parental alienation. I'll never forget, I was grieving with my ex when we're sitting there watching our kids jump on the trampoline. And we both got tears in our eyes and started talking that we will never see them as much as what we want to or hope to as a whole family unit anymore if we split. And so alienation is that times a million because you don't get to see them all the time or if at all or very minimal. And so you you see them, you get so excited or you talk to them and then that goes away and you don't see them again for another 6 months. So I feel like some of this and some of even what you're talking about in a divorce is continual grieving.
And sometimes you feel like you're starting all over again, which is why I always think the stages are a bit of a BS, because we can go through, like, you're grieving people that are still alive.
Hmm.
You're grieving the fact that you don't get access. Somebody recently asked me if I could see my husband again, would I? And I said it would depend on how long. I said if it meant I had to say goodbye to him again, I would never do it. Shit nearly killed me the first time. I can't imagine what it's like to do that with children. That you're like, I want to see them again, but I never know when. And so yeah, the grief would be intense. And then on top of that, add a death or a loss, and it feels insurmountable. It feels like this big snowball that's going down a big mountain and you don't know how to. And so people end up having to put on their armor, pretend to be something that they're not, because the world doesn't want to keep seeing them in pain. That's your situation. You know it. Just deal with it. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Doesn't mean that it isn't hard.
When we've talked before, you said that grief is all around us. And I'm curious what you mean by that. If you could expand on it a little bit.
Well, it's September right now. People have just sent their kids off to college, and that they could have empty nest syndrome. So your neighbor right now could be grieving. Your neighbor could be diagnosed with a terminal illness or a big illness. Think about it. If you break your leg and you can't drive for 6 or 8 weeks because you're in a cast, you will grieve. You're independent. And so grief is all around us. It's when we are moving through a loss or change of any kind. We have changes all around us every single day. I don't say easier. Grief is never easier, right? Like somebody says to me, you're 5 years out. Is your grief easier now? It's different. But I can still have a day that is like the day I lost him. But I don't have those days every day anymore. They're more infrequent. But they can still be just as intense. And so grief is never easier. And so, it's about working our muscle and being able to give ourselves permission to acknowledge the fact that it's grief and that we deserve to honor ourselves to move through those emotions, because that grief is love. you know and I remember that first counseling session. That's what my counselor said to me. I was blubbered crying. It was not pretty, and I apologized. I said, I'm really sorry. She goes, Heidi, when I witness deep grief, it's because I'm witnessing deep love, and it's an honor to sit here with you. It would not hurt if we didn't love these things, right? You don't lose your noodle at the grocery store.
You had said a few minutes ago, and I think this is really important. You mentioned that we need to be functional again. So, how do we get from grieving after a trauma, getting ourselves up in the morning, to functional?
One, make sure that you ask for help, right? And whether that be the people around you, the families that supports you, or your friends. If you don't have that, and we can have the conversation about what that looks like later, but also look at getting counseling. And if you're grieving, like especially a death, I always say go to a grief coach or a grief counselor. And the reality is there's lots of psychotherapists and lots of psychologists and lots of doctors that are not well trained in grief. And so go to somebody that specializes in it. Because I remember the very first counselor I went to actually said, you're doing everything right. I don't know if there's any way that I can help you. And I was like, these four walls, I said, you don't know me. You don't love me. Like, you're not judging me, because grief comes with a ton of judgment, ton self-judgment. You judge yourself. And then because it's as individuals, our fingerprint, people judge each other on how they move through it. And so I was like, this is a place where I actually get to express myself, and you don't get to judge me. And that's what I need. And she was like, I don't feel like I'm helping you. She couldn't see that she was helping, right? Because you can't fix dead, right?
Right.
And when a relationship comes to an end and you've decided to part ways, most likely you've already done the counseling. the decision has been made. And it's like, it's okay just to hold space with a counselor to be able to say, I just need to grieve this loss. I need to move through it. I need to learn what is going to come forward for me now and what that quote, and I hate this term, new normal is going to look like.
Right.
Right. And I loved it before COVID until
Yeah, right.
it was right. Like
Yeah.
COVID ruined. But,
Yes.
right. But it really is about allowing yourself the permission to go there. And because we live in this world that doesn't like pain, we avoid it. And we don't feel like we have the ability to express it to people or for extended periods of time. You know, you look at death about a week or two after a funeral, people don't want to hear about it anymore.
Mm.
But your grief lasts way longer than that. And if you're dealing with divorce and parental alienation, it's going to be reoccurring, you know. And I call grief the crazy train of grief. It is a 10 coupon ride and you don't get a choice of when to get off.
Mhm.
Well, the ride that you're on as being alienated from your children, that's a way more expensive ride. And you don't get to choose. You're not in control. And we know that when we don't have control, it's even harder to move through and navigate the emotion. And so you got to be graceful with yourself and find people around you that will embrace you in those moments and know that you don't get to choose when it stops because somebody else is controlling it.
Is that what you mean by saying that it is possible for a parent to be grieving if they've been alienated? And how does that connect with grieving as they see a child or children coming and going?
Oh, totally. Like they will grieve the loss of their relationship, but they will also grieve the loss of having access to their kids.
Mm.
And the fact that every time they go to say goodbye, they never know when their next hello will be. Right? The anticipatory grief is so hard. I honestly can't imagine. I watch those movies where they're teleported or they're time transferred into another time and they see somebody that they lose, that they've lost in another time in their life. And then they have to say goodbye and go back to their original time. And I lose my noodle because I can't even imagine. I know how hard it was to say goodbye the first time. To have to do it again or to have to do it over and over again. Yeah, it's gotta rip your heart out. And it has to be hard. I haven't been there, but if you're going through that, my heart goes out to you because you have zero control. Somebody else is controlling your emotions.
Many parents don't recognize the signs of grief. That's why I think it's important to talk to you. How can parents recognize the signs of grief and adjust in this coming and going of their children?
I think really it's about getting to know and being comfortable with yourself and understanding some of the umbrella terms. And I only listed off a handful of them. There's about 17 or 18 of them. I do offer a complimentary masterclass, a little plug, and I do cover all of the emotions. And so just visit my website and go to the events and join the masterclass anytime.
Well, Heidi, what you're doing is absolutely amazing. I know we're going to list your website in the show notes and how to get a hold of you. So thank you very much for
Thank you.
joining us and teaching about grief. And we're looking forward to hearing about, how we help those that are grieving and what we say to them in the next episode.
Honored to help. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks, Heidi. Learned a lot. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it very much. We don't want anyone to feel isolated, and we kindly ask your support to positively review The Aftermath on Apple Podcasts. Thank you, Heidi, once again for being our guest today. Kindra, we'll see you next time. We'll have another great episode. Take care. Day is full.